The morning mist clung to the streets of Soweto as Thomas Mthembu, 34, swept the floors of the small antique shop where he'd worked for nearly a decade. Books lined dusty shelves, forgotten furniture crowded the corners, and the smell of old wood filled the air. Thomas moved methodically, the same routine he'd followed every day since losing his teaching job. The owner, Mrs. van der Merwe, barely paid him enough to survive, but it was work. Today felt different, though. A wealthy collector had died, and his entire estate was being sold. Boxes upon boxes of items arrived that morning, more than the shop had seen in years. As Thomas sorted through a particularly heavy wooden crate, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a worn leather journal, wedged between old photograph albums. The cover was simple, unmarked, but something about it made him pause. He opened it carefully, and his breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable, even after all these years. Day 1847 of imprisonment. It began. Thomas's hands trembled. This wasn't just any journal. The signature at the bottom of the first page confirmed what his heart already knew. N.R. Mandela. Thomas glanced around the empty shop, his pulse quickening. Mrs. van der Merwe was in the back office, arguing loudly on the phone about pricing. He shouldn't be reading this. He shouldn't even be touching it. But as his eyes scanned the first entry, dated from Robben Island, he couldn't look away. Today I watched a young guard struggle with anger. Mandela had written, I see in him the same fury I once carried. Perhaps tomorrow I will find a way to speak to his heart. Thomas felt something stir inside him, a recognition he couldn't quite name. Thomas had grown up hearing stories about Mandela from his grandfather, who'd been active in the struggle. But life had worn him down. After university, he tried to teach, tried to make a difference, but the system crushed him. Budget cuts, overcrowded classrooms, students who'd given up hope. He'd become bitter, angry at a country that seemed to promise change, but delivered only more struggles. His own son barely spoke to him anymore, tired of hearing his father's complaints about how things used to be better. Thomas had stopped believing in heroes, in change, in anything beyond surviving another day. For 3 days, Thomas read in secret. Each entry revealed something new. Not the public Mandela everyone knew, but a man wrestling with doubt, anger, and the weight of an entire nation's hopes. Some days I want to give up. One entry read, the guards mock me, my body aches, and I wonder if anyone remembers why I'm here. But then I remember young Thomas from Soweto, who wrote me that letter. He believes we can be better. I cannot fail the children who still have hope. Thomas's eyes widened. His own name, his own letter, written as a schoolboy 30 years ago. The entry was dated just months before Mandela's release. Today I received news that young Thomas Mthembu became a teacher. The boy who once wrote to me about his dreams of educating children has grown into a man living that dream. In his letter, he says the work is hard, that change comes slowly, but he refuses to give up. He reminds me why we fought, not for the grand gestures, but for the quiet moments when one person decides to keep trying. If Thomas can find hope in a classroom in Soweto, I can find strength in this cell. Thomas wept, understanding flooding through him. That night, Thomas sat in his small apartment, the journal open before him. His son Saifo was visiting, and Thomas found himself telling him about the discovery. So what, Papa? Saifo said, frustration in his voice. You found some old book. How does that change anything? You still complain every day about this country, about your job, about everything. Thomas looked at his son, seeing his own lost hope reflected back. You're right, Thomas said quietly, but maybe it's not too late to remember who I wanted to be. The next morning, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He went to his old school in Soweto, the one where he taught before budget cuts eliminated his position. The principal, Mrs. Kumalo, was surprised to see him. Thomas, what brings you here? He took a deep breath. I want to volunteer. Reading program, after-school tutoring, anything you need. She studied his face, seeing something different. What changed? Thomas smiled. I remembered why I became a teacher in the first place. Not everyone was impressed by Thomas's sudden change. Mrs. van der Merwe was furious when she discovered the journal was missing from inventory. "You stole from me," she accused. The community was skeptical too. "Thomas has been bitter for years," neighbors whispered. "This won't last." Even some teachers at the school questioned his motives. But Thomas persisted, working with struggling students after his shop shifts, carrying Mandela's words in his heart. Change begins with one person deciding to be different. Slowly, things began to shift. The students Thomas tutored started improving. Word spread about the angry man who became kind. Other volunteers joined the program. Parents who had given up on their children's education began showing up to meetings. Thomas shared some of Mandela's private reflections, with permission from the Mandela Foundation, who authenticated the journal, and people began to see their own struggles reflected in those prison cell writings. 6 months later, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. At a community meeting about education funding, he stood up and told the complete story, finding the journal, reading about his own letter, and how Mandela's private struggles had inspired him to remember his purpose. The room was silent as he read one final entry. "True change doesn't happen in presidents' offices or parliament buildings. It happens when ordinary people like Thomas choose hope over bitterness, action over complaint. The future belongs to those who still believe it can be better." The story spread across South Africa and beyond. Thomas didn't become famous, but something more important happened. He became the teacher he'd always meant to be. The journal was donated to the Mandela Foundation, but not before Thomas copied every word by hand. His relationship with Sipho healed as his son watched his father rediscover his purpose. "I'm proud of you, Papa," Sipho said one evening. "Not because you found some famous diary, but because you found yourself again." A year later, the reading program Thomas started had expanded to 12 schools. Students who'd been written off were graduating, going to university, becoming teachers themselves. At the program's anniversary celebration, a young girl approached Thomas. "Mr. Mthembu," she said shyly, "I wrote a letter to my future self, like you taught us. I want to be a teacher too, just like you and Mr. Mandela." Thomas smiled, thinking of a prison cell on Robben Island and the power of one person's belief in tomorrow. Early morning in Soweto, 2 years later, Thomas still swept floors at the antique shop, but now he whistled while he worked. The shop had become an informal community center, where people gathered to share stories and dreams. On the wall hung a simple frame, not containing Mandela's journal pages, but Thomas's original letter from 30 years ago, the one that had given a prisoner hope during his darkest hours. Below it, a new sign. Every ordinary person has the power to change someone's world. The question is, will you use it? As Thomas opened the shop doors to another day, children ran past on their way to school, their backpacks filled with books and their hearts filled with hope. And in that moment, he understood what Mandela had known all along. The true transformation doesn't begin with grand gestures, but with one person deciding to believe again, one choice at a time.